So I would like to speak with you along the lines of the subject which I addressed to the Church Music Association of America yesterday. And it's kind of catechesis in the area of liturgy. Most of you whether as laypersons or as priests, understand that if you touch the liturgy at all, you get a lot of feedback and pushback sometimes from the lay faithful. But the Church Music Association of America asked me, though I have absolutely no musical expertise or training whatsoever, to address them. And so I wanted to just give a pastor's perspective, both as a growing up first as a son of immigrants, what my experience of the liturgy was like, what I learned through my experience in seminary and as a young priest, then as a doctoral student in Rome, and then as a seminary professor and academic dean. And finally, eventually as a pastor, what are some strategies we tried to use for liturgical formation? And then finally, as a bishop, what are we trying to do here in the Diocese of Columbus? I say this because in Desiderio Desideravi, Pope Francis talks about ongoing liturgical formation, not only for clergy, that is priests and deacons, but also for all the faithful, whether it's persons like yourselves who are master catechists or in the process of becoming master catechists, or whether it's the people in the pews. We all need ongoing formation in the sacred liturgy. But rather than give a rather scholarly talk, I'd simply like to talk to you about my own life story and journey and that of my family. My parents and brothers were immigrants from India. They came in 1970. We attended Mass at our parish church in Toledo, Ohio. On the east side, it was a poor neighborhood. My parents had beautiful singing voices, and I noticed that my mother would always sing in church. My father would never sing in church. And when I asked him once as a child, he said, "Oh, I like to listen." He was very prayerful always, but I could tell he was getting a little bit irritated. What do I mean by that? Well, what I did not know at the time is that my father had been a Jesuit seminarian from 1953 to 1957 in India. He had a great love for Latin as a language and for liturgical Latin. He was well versed in the liturgy. He had served as the seminary master of ceremonies. And when he was growing up, his boyhood parish priest was Valerian Gracious, who became the Cardinal Archbishop of Bombay. In India at that time, of course, even today, Christians were a distinct minority. And so the emphasis on Catholic identity was very strong. Cardinal Gracious was known even in the mid-70s to not dispense priests to pray the breviary in English. So you can see that this was my father's background, but I was not really aware of that, just that he didn't sing much in church. We attended our parish church at St. Thomas Aquinas, and for a while we had, and maybe some of you are old enough to remember, the People's Mass book. It was kind of a first attempt at an English hymnal. I had somewhat traditional hymnody, and it was workable and usable. But very quickly that was replaced by the Glory and Praise hymnal, along with various sheets of loose leaf paper with hymns composed by our parish musician, most of which were not of good quality. As a child growing up in the parish, I would say this at Mass, they would have us sing like what I would call kiddie songs at Mass. And we always thought they were a little bit ridiculous, and there was always in our mind a little bit of a disconnect between what we were actually doing at Mass and the music that accompanied it. It seemed like things were being lowered to our childish level rather than raising the child up. But again, we didn't have the language at that time to articulate what we were experiencing. We just thought this is a little bit strange. Equally strange, and of course it was the 1970s, we had nuns who were teaching us who were still in the habit. But then when we'd come for Mass, they would change into leotards for liturgical dancing, which accompanied the music. And this all seemed to be, seminarians laugh today when I tell them this. They can't even believe it. But this was our experience growing up. I mean, the sisters were well-meaning, but it just seemed to us at that time to be bizarre. But we had no means of actually articulating or expressing ourselves. But this was our experience of the liturgy as children. And so you can only imagine, if this is what we were thinking, what was going through the minds of the lay faithful who had grown up with the church's tradition, in particular the what we now call the Old Latin Mass, or the extraordinary form of the Mass. Of course, people at that time were actually quite docile and obedient to ecclesiastical authority and to the authority of the bishops. And therefore, they, for the most part, they were quite receptive to the liturgical changes. Although there were some who resisted the changes, or for nostalgic reasons were attached to the Latin Mass, the Gregorian chant, and so on and so forth, they too lacked the language to articulate what they sensed might be amiss. Moreover, there were some who saw what was going on with Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, but they were not ready to follow him, nor were they ready to break from the Pope or to rebel against ecclesiastical authority. Most people at that time, despite the spirit of the age, were inclined to go along with ecclesiastical authority, despite the sexual revolution, Humanae Vitae, and the unrest on college campuses and the Vietnam War. It was a time of great cultural revolution, but also of liturgical change. But for the most part, people wanted to be faithful, I would say. At least that was my impression in my boyhood parish. But thinking about my father's liturgical experience in India, I did not realize this, he was well-versed. He had a solid understanding of the liturgy. He had studied Sacrosanctum Concilium. The Cardinal Archbishop of Bombay had asked him to help the lay faithful to understand the document better, as well as the document on the role of the laity. He had a good understanding of the Concilium, which was the commission that was put together to help implement the liturgical reform. And so what went wrong with the Concilium? And he liked traditional church music, even if we never heard him sing it actually in church. He never really spoke to us about any of his misgivings or about what he perceived as poor liturgical formation, because he wanted us to be integrated into the parish. A principal value for him was remaining in the church, thinking with the mind of the church, unity with the church, and recognizing that the church was more than a building. It was a place where we grew up, where we went to mass and school with the people from the area, where we interacted regularly with those people. And so we wanted to be rooted in the community, and my father wanted us to receive the sacramental grace. Only after he died, was cleaning out his den. Now, he had 37 boxes of theology books and philosophy books and 11 boxes worth of English literature books. He was a very well-read man, but we found the 10-page typed letters he used to write to our parish priests. I would never have wanted to receive those letters, but he was well catechized himself. He would quote church documents and things like that. And so he kept everything very professional and made his opinion known to the priest, but not to us, because being part of the church was important to him. But as our country changes in terms of ethnic and demographic makeup, I think one of the things with respect to the liturgy is not to make presumptions about what people like and don't like, or to presume that every immigrant to this country has a particular liturgical preference or style. Right? No one would have thought, oh, my father likes Gregorian chant. We were from India, after all. Who in India knew Gregorian chant? Well, actually, both my mother and father knew it because they were all taught it in school. Anecdotally, I would say here in the Diocese of Columbus, when I offer Mass for the Nigerian community, they always begin with the chant, Ecce Sacerdos Magnus. And so when I come in, and they do all the parts of the Mass in Latin, but when they go to hymnody or to the offertory or even the readings, they do them in their own tribal languages, not all of which are in common with one another. But they feel, the Nigerian community, they were evangelized by the Irish missionaries, that the use of these chants is a way of preserving unity. Similarly, Dr. Matt Geerlings is the director of sacred music at the Cathedral of St. Peter and Chains. It's a basilica, the Cathedral Basilica in Cincinnati, Ohio. But he previously had been the organist and music director at the cathedral in Sioux City, Iowa. And he would play the music both for the English masses and the Spanish masses. But for the Spanish masses, he would direct the choir, and they would always do folk music. And finally, some of the Hispanics asked him, why don't you ever play the organ for us? And he said, well, I thought you just liked folk music and this was your music. And they said to him, no, we thought you weren't playing the organ because we were poor, that we were not somehow worthy of the organ. And of course, there exists in Spanish a great repertoire of beautiful sacred music. And so this is the point I want to make when we're catechizing people about the sacred liturgy. We we might know where we are, but we shouldn't make presumptions about where the people are, or we should not make presumptions about people's liturgical tastes or their knowledge or exposure to sacred music or to the structure of the liturgy. But I digress. Returning to my family's experience, I would say that we children recognized kind of the disconnect between the actions of the Mass and the music at Mass. I mean, this was also the era of where the priest would dress up as a clown at Mass to try to engage children. And of course, we also thought this was ridiculous. We didn't recognize what my father's thoughts were, but at a certain point, probably when I was about 10 years old, he took us to St. Joseph Church in Toledo. The priest there was so old in 1970, he never had to switch to the new order of the Mass. And so he lived till about 1985. So from time to time, my father would take us there for Mass. And there, we just thought, okay, we're going to Mass. For us, the Mass was the Mass was the Mass. Our focus was, when we were focused as children at Mass, was on receiving communion or saying our prayers as my mother and father taught us to pray. But my father, I saw, was finally had a sense of peacefulness. During the same time growing up, my parents took us annually on a pilgrimage to the Shrine of Our Lady of Consolation in Cary, Ohio. It was run by the conventual Franciscans. It is in the middle of farm country, but a huge basilica. And so we would go there, and the organ in this church was magnificent. The whole space was magnificent. There was a beautiful mural of Christ the King with the angels and saints all around him, the beautiful high altar, side altars with a statue of Our Lady of Consolation where many miracles had happened. The statue was brought back from Luxembourg in 1850, and the different groups of people would make special vestments for the image of the Madonna. The organ was beautiful, and it was there that I heard on that organ, we were exposed to exposition of the Blessed Sacrament, certain devotions. I heard O Salutaris and Tantum Ergo for the first time. And the music was worthy of the space, and the space was worthy of the liturgy. And there were other things there at the Basilica. We had rosary procession with the statue of Our Lady of Consolation. We had prayers and devotions, including prayers with the relics of the True Cross and St. Anthony of Padua. My mother would make us light candles at the statue of the Infant of Prague. There was a statue of Christ in the sepulchre, and she'd make us bend down and kiss the wounds of Christ. All these things shaped the Catholic imagination. And so that's a second insight, I would say, is sacred music is integral to the formation of the Catholic imagination, but also church architecture and art. All those things contribute to the formation of the Catholic mind. There are also other things, Catholic literature, but the devotional life of the people is very important. And therefore, we as Catholics in the United States ought to pay very close attention to the devotions, to the hymnody, to the imagination of all the different peoples that are now coming to our country. These things are very important for their faith, especially when people are not well catechized. Yet they can also be instruments for evangelization. And I think in particular, liturgical inculturation. For example, my sister-in-law was a Hindu for about 19 years, well, more than 19 years. She was married to my brother for 19 years before she converted to Catholicism. And for a long time, they had no art up, sacred art, because they were of different religions in their home. But I went to India and I bought a batik of Jesus sitting in the lotus position, but dressed in red and white like the image of the Sacred Heart. His hands were clearly pierced with the wounds. And in front of him was the Eucharist. But he also had his fingers positioned the way Hindus picture in art divinity. So it was clearly true God and true man, the one who suffered upon the cross, had risen. And that was the image they had. But that image somehow spoke to my sister-in-law, and eventually she converted to Catholicism. So forming the Catholic imagination, I think, is quite important for catechesis in the area of liturgy. Returning then to kind of the life story, I would say throughout high school and college, we attended Mass at our parish church. But in Toledo, Ohio, you have a lot of ethnic Eastern Europeans. So we went to Polish parish, St. Mary Magdalene, but it shared a pastor with the Slovak parish 1 mile away, St. Cyril and Methodius. And the architecture reflected the Poles and the Slovaks. But the music was typical of that era. Marty Haugen, Bernadette Farrell, David Haas, this sort of thing. And while it was slightly better from the free-for-all of the 1970s, there seemed to be a disconnect. During my high school years, then I took Latin in high school. And so I would like to go then from time to time to practice my Latin with my father to St. Joseph Church. And so I began to be exposed more and more to sacred music without any political or ideological motivation. I simply enjoyed it, was attracted to it. I heard some of the best of our tradition. And I would say this would be a third point. Sacred music creates that space in which people can hear the voice of God and encounter the living God. I think if you could walk across the shrine, maybe you have, to the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, I noticed that going there with my father, I could pray without distraction and begin to listen to God's word and hear his voice as I discern my vocation. I think this is also an important thing. Is music at the service of the liturgy? Does it actually help people to pray and to encounter the living God? Or is it more of a performative nature? The same could be true with the priests when they offer Mass, the Ars Celebrandi, or catechizing. Are we pointing to ourselves, or are we pointing people to God? I think this is also kind of an important dimension of liturgical catechesis, which should be God-directed. I think if you were to attend Divine Liturgy with any of the Eastern Catholic churches, you would know that you worship God. We recently at the Bishops' Conference meeting in Louisville, at a certain point, we were praying mid-morning prayer or something like that. And at a certain point, we had to say the Kyrie eleison 40 times. So 40 times you're beseeching God, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. And you know that you're speaking to God, and you're a sinner in need of his mercy, looking for him who has the power to forgive you. And so I think that's the thing, that prayer, sacred music, the liturgy should be God-directed. From Toledo, I moved to Cincinnati to attend medical school at the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. And so while I was in university, I studied in Salford, England. There, in England, I thought, well, I'm not under my parents' roof. Maybe this is when I start skipping Mass, right? But actually, in England, the only thing that was familiar to me was not the language. It was actually the Mass, because the British all have all kinds of accents and things. It wasn't the language, it was this Mass, the structure of the Mass, encountering Christ in Holy Communion. I found myself not only not skipping Mass, but going every day. And I formed bonds of communion with the other university students who were going every day. And we had a great chaplain who had a great singing voice. He could preach the word of God well. He was an Irishman, Father Ian Kelly. But I remember when I was in Cincinnati, I was trying to go to weekday Mass, and there was a beautiful church, St. Monica St. George, the Newman Center on the campus of the University of Cincinnati. And it really is gorgeous, with lots and lots of mosaics and pillars and things. Again, the Catholic imagination was fostered there. But I got in a fight with the priest there over liturgical things. He said a fast Mass. I asked him if I could. He said a fast Mass. Could I receive communion after Mass? Begrudgingly, he went to the tabernacle. One thing led to another, but we got in a huge fight. And my faith was truly shaken by some of the things he said. And so I wrote to the Archbishop of Cincinnati. He said, well, say one Hail Mary for the priest. But it didn't do anything for me. My faith was shaken. But I remembered Father Kelly's words. Well, if an Irishman doesn't like the bartender, does he give up drinking? He said, no, he just goes to the next pub up the road. Well, that turned out to be Sacred Heart Italian Church in Cincinnati. The Scalabrini fathers had that church. And I went and I saw the two priests. They were 85 and 75 years old, and they had Mass. They didn't preach, and they looked happy. And the architectural space was beautiful. It was a 19th century German church that had been given over to the Italians, who their church was closed, but they brought their altar, the communion rail, all their statues. So it was two churches in one with lots and lots of stuff. But the priests looked happy, and they were faithful, and they were disciplined with the liturgy. And so I said, I could be 75 years old and be happy and be a priest. And so I went to talk to the younger of the two priests, Father Mario Rousey. As it turns out, he was born in 1921 in Trent. He entered the seminary in 1933 as a 12-year-old boy. Was ordained in 1945 and came to Chicago knowing no English. And by this time, it was 1995 when I first met him. But he had a great interest in music. He studied music when he was in the seminary, composed a few pieces, and would have sacred concerts, sacred music concerts in this beautiful liturgical space. As it turned out, the organ there was an 1895 Felgermaker organ. So Felgermaker was a German organ company, first based in Pennsylvania, later in Wisconsin. About the first 100 organs they made in the United States are historically valuable, and ours was one of them. And so he made sure that the organ was used, and again, the music was fitting for the place, but the liturgical actions were consistent with the music. And so there was a seriousness, a gravitas to what was happening there. As it turns out, they had a Saturday evening mass, and then they had 8, 10, and 12 o'clock mass in English and 1:30 Latin mass. So I could go to English mass or Latin mass as I pleased, but the music was always good, and the worship space was always prayerful, and the priests were faithful. And this is, I guess, a point I would like to make is that, and the Pope makes this point in Desiderio Desideravi, the liturgy demands discipline. Discipline on the part of the priest, discipline on the part of the liturgy. It's because it's not ours. It's the church's. It's no individuals, and therefore it demands liturgy. But I would say that the music of the liturgy, in addition to the sacramental grace, gave me an experience of interior peace. I appreciated the fact that the priests understood very well where the people were in terms of their musical preferences, but also where the people were in terms of their catechesis, their formation, and in that particular parish, a desire for greater reverence. So there was no movement toward an ideological imposition of music or liturgical practice, but there was a pastoral sensitivity to the journey of faith of the people, and that which would be conducive to a continual growth in faith. And this would be the third insight. Sacred music, sacred architecture, liturgical practice should assist the journey of faith. As a seminary professor, I would often pose a question to prospective priests. Am I being a bridge or a barrier? A bridge or a barrier? I would say this liturgical practice should be a bridge for people on their journey of faith, should assist them. We know where we would like them to be, or what the church's ideals are, or what the church's proposes, or what the church's norms are. But the reality between parish life and the norms is not always the same. And so we have to be sensitive to where people are, recognizing, and the Pope talks about accompaniment, pastoral accompaniment. I would also speak about liturgical accompaniment, helping people to grow in faith. It's the same way when you're learning languages. At first, babies just cry. Then they say, Papa, Mama. Then they string a few words together and they start to babble, but they don't have good grammar or diction. Then they take some classes and they start to perfect the language until they gain a degree of proficiency. That same growth can happen in the area of the church's liturgy. But the priest there at Sacred Heart Italian Church helped me to grow. And after 2 years of discernment, I then went to the Casa Balthasar in Rome to figure out if I wanted to be a doctor, priest, or both. At that time, I wasn't sure what I would do, but eventually, after a year there in Rome, I returned to Mount St. Mary's Seminary of the West in Cincinnati and began my seminary instruction. During that time in Rome, I would say this, we had a very strict rule of life, but each night we would chant night prayer. And we would chant it in Latin, but the discipline of praying night prayer, of having a daily recollection, examination of conscience, and praying the church's liturgy, not just the Mass, but the liturgy of the hours, helped set a rhythm of the day. It helped close the day. It helped start the next day. And so that's a type of a discipline too, the liturgy of the hours and setting the rhythm of the prayer that I think catechists can encourage. And this will be particularly true. We bishops in Louisville, we approved the last of the translations for the new version of the Liturgy of the Hours. Now we just wait the Confirmatio from Rome and then the publication of the books. But that would be a time for encouraging the lay faithful to become familiar with the Liturgy of the Hours and the rhythm of liturgical prayer, the liturgical seasons, and liturgical time. I entered the seminary in Cincinnati in 1997. And of course, there I learned to take music lessons, voice lessons, my worst subject in seminary, by the way, but was also exposed to the history and development of the church's liturgical tradition and, in particular, musical tradition. I think at that time, I gained a great appreciation for what had been, what is, and where the liturgy might go. But I would say both my peers and myself, we were a little bit frustrated because we would hear great things from our tradition, and then we would be frustrated because we would never get to use any of the things from our tradition, except at choral concerts or at solemn vespers, which often were more performative than prayerful. And so I think sometimes we get young clergy who see this and have the same frustration, but their approach is then, okay, now I'm ordained, I'm going to impose this upon the parishes without the pastoral sensitivity for which I just spoke. And I think you as catechists could assist the priests in saying, how do we gradually bring the people along? How do we form them so that they can appreciate the best of the church's tradition? And so I would say you kind of have to be cautious, or at least realistic. What is the difference between the rarefied air of seminaries and universities, the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, and your rural parish where they don't even have an organ, and maybe they have a guitarist, but maybe not? So be realistic about what is possible in your particular context or situation. And I saw this not only as a newly ordained priest, but even when I was a seminary professor, the difference between the ideal and the norms and the reality. So it has been my experience, and this would be my next point, that gradual change works best. Having realistic expectations and taking the time to do ongoing liturgical formation can move things in the right direction. I will say when I was ordained as a priest, I was so bad they sent me 100 miles north of Cincinnati, and they did, to a town of Sidney, Ohio. My pastor was a good priest, a faithful priest. He'd been a canon lawyer. He was from that rural area of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. He was an excellent Latinist. In fact, he was a scribe at the Second Vatican Council. He was one of the official scribes. He did all the Latin shorthand, and then on his Smith Corona typewriter, would type up excerpts in English so that the American bishops who weren't so good in Latin would know what had been said at the council. So he had a great knowledge of the council and a healthy respect for ecclesiastical authority, tradition, and liturgical discipline. Things were pretty good up there. We had a nice organist and everything, but we also had the children's glory and praise hymnal, which the songs were awful. They were all about the butterflies and rainbows, but not too much about Jesus. And so he thought, well, what are we going to do here? And so he and I strategized or conspired. Let's have all school masses and have the church organist play at the all school masses with the idea that what the children experienced at school would be preparatory for what they were going to experience at Sunday Mass, that there would be a common hymnody. And this seemed to work. And then the children's glory and praise books, he said, well, let's just let them fall apart and then we won't buy them. We won't buy new ones to replace them, which is exactly what he did. So because some of the teachers he knew were attached to those hymnals. The students weren't so much attached, but and then there were no fights. He kept the peace. In that sense, he was very prudent. He was a prudent and wise pastor. And so the 1 week of the month, though, where the kids would come to Mass, he assigned the young assistant to preside at the Mass with all the young people and all the kiddie music. And so it was my little penance, I think. But we didn't rock the boat, but we moved things in the right direction. Right around that time, then I said I was so bad after 2 years, they sent me across the Atlantic Ocean to Rome. And so this was at the end of the pontificate of John Paul II and the beginning of Benedict XVI. And so then you are exposed to the church's liturgy in Rome with the Bishop of Rome, and it's beautiful. And in particular, Benedict XVI had a particular interest in liturgy. And so it was kind of what I would call very, very high liturgy. Again, in the church's tradition, you met people from all over the world. And so you began to understand the different cultural influences, the different likes and dislikes, the universality of the church, and the need for a type of a unity. But I came back to Cincinnati and was assigned as an academic dean at the seminary. And we needed to find a new professor for sacramental theology and for liturgical theology. And so I found a Dominican. So you're not far from the Dominican House of Studies, who had been president of the Society for Catholic Liturgy. But the change in professors made a difference. The content of what was being taught in terms of sacramental theology, in terms of liturgical theology in the textbooks that were being used, because this shaped the hearts and minds of the next generation of priests, deacons, and there at the seminary in Cincinnati, they also offered master's degrees programs in theology, biblical studies, and in pastoral ministry, not unlike the program you're going through. So this would form the formators, so to speak. This is in a way what we hope to do through this Zoom call, but then you in turn, in your roles in the parishes, will be forming catechists, PSR, teachers, these sorts in the liturgy. You'll be assisting the priests. You might lead the liturgy, the hours, all that. You might be catechists and the catechist of the Good Shepherd, but somehow or the other, you'll be shaping and forming. So there's an importance in the textbooks. There's an importance to be familiar with the church's documents, but again, also to be understanding what was Benedict XVI trying to do with the so-called hermeneutic of continuity. What is Pope Francis trying to do by talking about liturgical discipline and the need for ongoing liturgical formation while implementing an authentic renewal as desired by the Council? Interestingly, after 6 years as academic dean, my last 2 years as academic dean, I was reassigned. Well, I kept all my roles at the seminary, but with the priest shortage, they just give you more jobs. So I was assigned back to Sacred Heart Italian Church. And the Scalabrini priests, Father Mario and Father Vincent, were now 93 and 84 years old. And so it was time for them to retire. And they needed a priest who knew English, Italian, and Latin, so they assigned me there. And I knew all the people in the parish, but the first thing on the order, my very first day, I sent a contract to the Archbishop to sign to restore the organ. Now, some people might say, why spend so much money on an organ? Well, because it was a historical instrument for the good of the patrimony. So you have to also consider liturgical patrimony in your churches. Sometimes it's the musical instrument. Sometimes it's the statues and the high altars. But certain things in the church's liturgy have great historical importance. And of course, for the service of the liturgy, not just as a museum, right? And so we did that, and we had Latin Mass choir, but I also engaged young people at the English Masses to sing. Some young girls who were homeschooled, they were in part of a family, they had good voices, I noticed, and they would sing at Mass. They liked to sing. So I said to the organist, why don't you start a schola? And these girls got some of their friends and then some of their parents, and they formed a choir. And they also, I wanted to get the Italians involved too. You know, the Italians wanted the social hall, but they didn't always want to come to Mass. So I said, well, I'm going to start an Italian Mass. And so they came. And then they'd have their social after the Mass. But it was a way of using the liturgy, if you will, not just to impart sacramental grace, but to build community, to get people who now had moved out of the Italian neighborhood to come together. But the choir of young people that I had put together, they also decided to sing for the Italian Mass. So they began to learn languages in order to serve the liturgy. Now, most of the time, you're not going to be learning Italian, but you will be learning, many parishes, Spanish. It's necessary now. For example, in the Diocese of Columbus, 1 out of every 7 people coming to Mass now on Sunday speak Spanish. So I've been trying to convince people, the priests especially, we're no longer a small diocese. We're no longer an Anglo-German-Irish diocese. We're a diverse diocese that reflects the universal church. And so we have to have a change in mindset and to recognize our changed reality. So recognizing the change that we have experienced and acknowledging it and trying to evangelize in that cultural context in and through the liturgy. But I would say this then, I was then shipped. I was so bad there after 8 years. They shipped me to Washington, D.C., but they wouldn't let me be in a parish. So I was sent to work at the Apostolic Nunciature. And the Apostolic Nunciature is the Vatican Embassy there in Washington on Massachusetts Avenue. But we didn't have a liturgical life really. We had Mass and Liturgy of the Hours inside the chapel, the tiny chapel there. But most of the time, we accompanied the Apostolic Nuncio to the National Shrine across the street from where you are. And the music there, under the direction of Dr. Peter Latona, is beautiful. Dr. Sullivan could testify to that. Again, the highest of the church's liturgy. But working at the embassy, they didn't really want us to say Mass publicly so much. So I would only go out because all of our work was secretive. I was under pontifical secret. So I would go out to say Mass for Mother Teresa's sisters, which is very different, at the Gift of Peace House on Otis Avenue there. And it's a very simple chapel. The sisters live a radical poverty. And so they don't actually have, they have their own songbook, which is all typed up because no sister can have something that another sister doesn't have elsewhere in the world. And you have typed songs in Latin and English, glory and praise songs, traditional songs, but the sisters sing beautifully. No matter what they sing, it's beautiful. And there's none of the irritation that you experience in the parishes. And if I ask myself why, I've reflected upon why, it's because of their commitment to holiness of life. So we say lex orandi, lex credendi, but Pope Benedict XVI in Sacramentum Caritatis also talks about lex vivendi, having a kind of an integrity of life that matches the church's liturgy and the church's belief. I would suggest that there was no irritation because of their authenticity, their simplicity of life, and their commitment to holiness. And the joy of faith, echoed and radiated by the sisters, brought a new experience to the liturgy. Theirs was not a performance when they sang. It was praise directed toward God. And so this is what I would say. Sacred music, sacred worship is at the service of the worship of God, is at the service of God. It is not a performance. So what could I say that I then tried as a pastor? Because I became a pastor in 2019 only. So I was working at the nunciature, and there was a scandal back in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati. There was a parish with 3,000 families, 1,160 kids in the elementary school. So the largest Catholic elementary school in Ohio. The priest there was accused of 7 counts of sexual abuse of minors, stemming from when he was a layman teaching music at a Catholic school in the Archdiocese. The auxiliary bishop seemed to have known the priest's proclivities, but didn't report it to the archbishop. They didn't tell the priest personnel board the priest was assigned to this parish, and the whole thing exploded. So I was asked to be pastor of this parish. So in November of 2019, I went there, and the parish had a Saturday vigil mass, and then Sunday masses. They had 6:30, 8:30, 10:15, noon, and 7:30 p.m. And I was there by myself. But the Saturday vigil mass was typical of most parishes. 6:30 morning mass, no music. It was called the golfer's mass. 6:30, you get mass done, lickety split, so you can get on with the day, get your round of golf in. Or we had a hospital right next door. So if you had a 7 to 7 shift, you could go, the nurses could go to mass and still make it to work. Then 8:30 mass was traditional music. 10:15 was guitar music, contemporary guitar type music. Noon mass was kind of a mix of 1970s type music and contemporary music. And 7:30 was the youth mass with all kind of guitar rock type music, because the youth group used to do the mass. Then they moved youth group to Wednesday, so it was only the last chance mass with contemporary rock music. The idea that the people had in the parish was each person could go to the type of mass they preferred and get the music they wanted, or no music in the case of the 6:30 morning mass. But they did not see that the liturgy should be a source of unity rather than division. They divided the parish according to musical taste rather than trying to have have an awareness of the church's liturgical norms, or to find unity amongst the different people in the parish. So if you didn't like a particular type of music, there was no room for you at the other masses. You sort of had to, plug your ears and go, if you will, or go to a different parish. If we can speak of blessings from the pandemic, it was that much of the bad liturgical music and bad liturgical practice was eliminated. I must also say, they not only had guitars, drums, and all that sort of thing, they still had all liturgical dancing and all the things from the 1970s at the parish. But we had an active worship commission that was willing to be led, willing to study and do the liturgical formation. And they began to say, well, how can we prepare our people if they move to a different parish, if they move away for college, if they go to a different part of the country? How can we prepare them for more normative worship? Well, with the pandemic, well, first, even before the pandemic, I worked with them to eliminate the 7:30 evening mass. It really wasn't serving the needs of the parish and was just adding an extra mass. And it wasn't even bringing enough collection to pay the visiting priest. Secondly, with the pandemic, then all the masses were eliminated for a while. But when we resumed from the pandemic, we only had three masses with music, three masses with music at 8:30, 10:15, and noon. And 6:30 morning mass remained with no music. But I asked our church organist to play two out of the three masses. That way she could play consistent hymnody at the different masses, and the other groups in the parish, musical groups, could have a rotation so that there would be greater consistency from mass to mass to mass to bring about a type of a unity within the parish. During the type of pandemic, then I would have mass in the church and live stream it, but I was by myself. During this time, I could expose people to the chants of the Roman Missal. And people would often send me emails. Well, what was that chant? Whether English or Latin, or even the Marian antiphons, such as the Alma Redemptoris Mater during the Advent and Christmas seasons, or the Regina Caeli during the Easter season. What were those? So I was able to do a type of a liturgical catechesis. With the director of adult faith formation, we used Mundeleин's Liturgical Institute had a video series on the different parts of the Mass. So we were able to catechize people on liturgical music, the norms of the church's liturgy, the different parts of the Mass. And we did so without too much division, in part because we had bigger problems with the pandemic and with the need to get people back to Mass and to understand the need for Sunday Mass, to understand what spiritual communion was and what the actions of the Mass were, even if we weren't always receiving communion, the nature of the Mass as sacrifice. So the pandemic offered an opportunity for liturgical catechesis. And I would say that we don't have a pandemic now, we have an opportunity because of the Eucharistic revival. To do this, we had the diocesan phase this year. We're having the big national pilgrimage to culminating in Indianapolis in the Eucharistic Congress. And then next year will be the year for mission. So we see the lex vivendi of which I spoke should come to the fore. But emerging from the pandemic, I recognized that many children had gotten out of the rhythm of going to Mass at all. As was, they weren't going to Mass very much, certainly not Sunday Mass. The parents thought, well, if I put my kid in the Catholic school, then they'll go to Mass once a week. Whether it was Tuesday, Thursday, Wednesday, it didn't matter. Sunday was unimportant. So we tried to get people back to Sunday Mass, but because we had 120 kids per grade level, we still had some social distancing norms. Kids came to Mass once a month. And so once a month, they didn't know when to stand, sit, and kneel. They didn't know any of the responses of the Mass, so we could start from scratch. But we noticed they weren't singing either. So there was a young woman, she was the innovation teacher at the school. She ran the 3D printing lab and so on, but she taught primary grades principally. She had a beautiful voice and she would play the piano at Mass. But I could tell that she had a great love. Her voice was so good, it touched the soul, we might say. So I began to speak to her about forming a children's choir, a children's schola. And she said, Father, that's interesting because most little children can't read. They can't read very well, and ours was an inclusion school. So the children struggled, a lot of the children struggled to read. They had learning disabilities. And so she said, but children, they might not be able to read 5 stanzas of a hymn, but they can memorize one line of a psalm and sing that. And so we began to teach them the entrance, offertory, and communion antiphons of the church's liturgy. And then their parents would want to hear them sing, and their grandparents would want to hear them sing, and they'd all come to Mass, especially when we have the kids on Sundays or on like Immaculate Conception or some days like this. So we gradually drew parents and grandparents back to Mass through the children. And the children like to sing, and they don't have any of the political or liturgical or ideological baggage that we adults sometimes have. And so that we began to do this, and the children began to sing and learn the chants in English and Latin. They learned new musical pieces, and there was an openness. One thing, one step at a time. And so they did form a schola. And the grandparents were saying, hey, wait a minute, this is what we were singing as children. And so we were able to reestablish a type of continuity. We also did this because we were having more and more Spanish speakers begin to move. And so the chant tones for the music also could be done in English or Spanish. And that also was helpful in preparing people for a diversified country. We also began to actually do the chant tones and things that were in the Roman Missal, especially for Holy Week. And the people of the parish had never experienced it. They had never experienced the washing of the feet, or Good Friday, the chanting of the Passion, the singing of the reproaches, the singing of the Exultet, according to the Roman Missal. They had never even heard of some of it before. And so it was a beginning of reestablishing and implementing the reform that the council wanted. We're just beginning to turn a corner because we also began the catechesis of the Good Shepherd at the parish. And so little children were coming to the atrium. They were learning about the different liturgical seasons, what the priest's vestments were, what liturgical colors there were. They were learning their Bible stories. With the catechesis of the Good Shepherd, they had a little altar, a little chalice, and the kids learn the different things of the parts of the Mass, and they're very attentive at Mass. So if you forget something, they'll tell you after Mass even. But bringing the parents to the atrium, the kids would take the parents to their favorite part of the atrium and talk to them. And the parents would say, this is exactly why I'm sending my child to a Catholic school. But we also offer the catechesis of the Good Shepherd for those in public schools. And the children began to be better formed liturgically through the catechesis of the Good Shepherd. We were just turning a corner, and then I became Bishop of Columbus. I have to say that the parish sort of liturgically reverted since I left. And I'm not going to get into all the reasons why or even make any judgments about that. But I might say, well, why go through all the effort, get some pushback, if it's just going to be undone so easily? And I would say it's because Jesus Christ makes a difference in each person's life. The young woman who had the beautiful voice and organized the choir had better liturgical formation. She herself was so committed to it that she learned to play the organ. She had a personal conversion, and she's now continuing to evangelize the children and their parents. Even though the school children's choir no longer sings at that parish, they've been invited to sing at the cathedral choir, so they have a wider audience, and they continue to evangelize through the liturgy. They went to the Pueri Cantores gathering in Pittsburgh last year, and they were exposed to other children around the country. So their awareness, like, we're not the only ones doing this type of music. Why do it? Well, because the faith is transmitted through the liturgy. And even if people aren't receptive, at least they begin to understand through liturgical formation what the church teaches and why the church teaches what she teaches. You know, Dostoevsky says, beauty will save the world, so we should try to make something beautiful for God and his glory, even if it's not always received. I know I probably have gone over time, so what have I been trying to do as bishop? Well, in general, I visited all the parishes. Our quality of sacred music is pretty good. In about 5 or 6 of our elementary schools have really, truly great children's choirs. The teachers, music teachers, and the children themselves are committed to the music. They're committed to the extra practices. They recognize the beauty of the liturgy, and the pastors are supportive of them. I would also say then high schools was very different. It was non-liturgical music. So we had meetings with the high school administrators, principals, and chaplains. We exposed them to what sacred music is. Church Music Association of America has a little booklet about that, question and answer booklet, which we used. We frequently ask questions on sacred music. We proposed new guidelines for high school masses. We exposed them to the USCCB's document on Catholic hymnody at the service of the church, an aid for evaluating hymn lyrics. And our own director of sacred music went through what is sacred music, what are the church's norms, compared contemporary music to the church's traditional music as a means of formation. And we'll see where it goes, right? We're just at the point of planting seeds, but we evangelize through the liturgy. And so if I could summarize, I would say this. Don't make presumptions about where people are, but expose them to the church's tradition. Understand that it is the church's tradition, not our own. So liturgical formation requires a type of discipline. We can't make presumptions, but we have to be faithful to the church's liturgy. The liturgy is a vehicle, true vehicle for evangelization, and that we need to have liturgical spaces that are worthy of the sacred liturgy as best as we are able. We need to try to make things beautiful for God through our music, through our design and interior design of the churches, through our images that all shape and form the Catholic imagination. You will be a great help to your priests in their parishes if you consult regularly with the priests, if you understand their vision for the liturgy, if you try to bring the church's vision of the liturgy and of sacred music and art and architecture to the parish, but gradually, step by step. It's not about where we are, it's about where they are and where we would want them to be. And in the end, we take one step at a time because we're going toward the new and eternal Jerusalem. Pope Benedict XVI said, being a Christian is not a result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea. It's a result of an encounter with an event or a person who opens up new horizons and gives our life a decisive direction. That's what we want to do through liturgical formation and catechesis. Help people to encounter the person of Jesus Christ, who opens up a new horizon for us, gives us a different vision of reality, and who gives our whole life a decisive direction so that we live a life consistent with the mystery we have received. I know I'm over time. I know someone probably should have thrown the flag a while ago, but thank you for your time and your attention.